Our 11 o'clock track, as we've mentioned all week, deals with what we're calling practical apologetics, things specifically talking about how to reach others and some of the problems that sometimes we run into with that. I would echo what Lance mentioned, that our open forum, we're going to ask the three men that have been leading the practical apologetics track to be up on stage, and we've encouraged the ladies that are teaching the ladies class to also be in here and offer any input that they would have from the audience. So it's encouraging, and we look forward to that. And I would ask you, if you're at all able to be back at 2 o'clock and to participate in that discussion. It's my honor to introduce Bruce Reeves. Bruce is married to Rachel, and they have one son, Connor, and they're here today. I asked both of them if they had any dirt to tell about him, and they said no. So, now he said they probably do, so that probably speaks well of them that they didn't disclose that. So. Bruce attended Hendrix College, and he has a BA from there. He also attended Harding College and has a BA from there. He is in the midst of working on a master's program through Harding Graduate School. He has, since 2000, worked with the Highway 65 Church in Conway, Arkansas. And that's how I first met him. I've got my son-in-law's family worships there, and his father's an elder there, and I got to know him through that. In the years since I first met him, we've come to be good friends and have had a lot of interaction. Bruce has done about 10 different religious debates, some of which are published by Truth Publications. And I worked with him in one in 2020 on the 80-70 doctrine at Olson Park in Amarillo, and really came to appreciate him and the good work that he did there. Truth Publications has done a book with that debate that's available in the foyer as well, and I encourage you to take a look at that. He also, in the books that we've been showing that are going to be short study books on the Holy Spirit and fellowship, he offered lessons that are a part of that, and he did an excellent job in those, and I encourage you to take a look at that. And we've also been mentioning that coming soon, Bruce and the four other guys that have been a part of this, Shane Carrington, Sean Chancellor, and Tyler Sams, in many ways kind of influenced the theme for this week in the fact that they have done a series at churches around the country dealing with apologetics, and very soon that will be put into book form, and that book is entitled, Is It Reasonable to Believe in God? So please keep an eye out for that. That will be coming very soon. And the material that Bruce is going to talk to us about this morning, how to help those struggling with suffering and how to answer the problem of suffering, Bruce especially deals with that in that material, Is It Reasonable to Believe in God? So it's my honor to introduce you to Brother Bruce Reeves.
It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I hear if you come to these morning sessions, you're part of the truly elect of God. So I'm thankful for you. It's such a joy to be with you. I remember very vividly walking into a living room of a couple who at the time had been worshiping with us at Highway 65, the congregation that we're members of and work with for some time. And they were completely broken as any couple that I've ever seen. Their son had declared atheism. He had been disciplined by that local congregation, and he had committed suicide on a Sunday afternoon while they were worshiping. I also remember very distinctly, in fact, it's etched into my mind, the memory of holding the hand of a dear sister who is very faithful to the Lord, who worshiped with us. And her husband had been fighting colon cancer for a number of years. They had 2 teenage children. And we were at UAMS, which is the University of Arkansas Medical Services there in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they were trying to do a procedure to see if this surgery would help him. And as they were in the middle of that procedure, the doctor called very quickly, which we knew probably wasn't a good sign. And the news came back that it was an inoperable spread of that cancer. I also remember very well holding my wife as she had had her second miscarriage and the loss of our child. And I also remember very well sitting at the bedside of my mother as she was passing away with 2 terminal neurological diseases. And the feelings, emotions, thoughts, questions that come into the minds of even the most avid and faithful believer. And if you were to start telling me about your experiences, I'm sure you would have a pretty long list of incidents in which you've had to deal with suffering. And for an agnostic or believer, suffering is a reality, isn't it? So it's not that some people experience suffering and others do not. If you live for a very long period of time at all, we live in a world that is full of suffering. The question is, how do we process that? How do we deal with that? What context, and this is very important, what context does that suffering get put into as we think about our God? As we think about whether or not we believe in God at all? It is a common experience. We all know it to be true. Bad things happen to good people. It's just a reality of life. And sticking our head in the sand and not talking about it doesn't help anybody, and it certainly won't convince the unbeliever. But even as a Christian, if we're to have the kind of faith that God wants us to have, a deep, robust, healthy faith, just saying, I'll believe in spite of these things, but I'll never think about it, I'll never talk about it, that's dangerous territory. It's very dangerous. Because one day, this issue will come home to us. It may be in the questions of our children and grandchildren, but it is a question that needs to be addressed. Now, I agree, and Job learned this a little bit the hard way. The who of our Creator is much greater than the why of suffering. But I don't know that we have to separate those things. There's many things we may never know this side of eternity, the secret things that belong to God. But what God has revealed, would it not be worthwhile for us to consider those things in our own faith? And so as we think about moral evil and physical evil and natural evil, which has been touched on already, how do we process these things? Let's not turn a deaf ear to our children and to our grandchildren and to our own need of faith in God and see the richness of who He really is as our Creator, as our Father. Now, the truth is, as we consider this question, this is certainly a real challenge to our faith. It's a challenge to anybody's faith. So saying, well, I just don't have to worry about those things. Really? The Old Testament prophets asked why. Jesus on the cross cried out why in the fulfillment of Psalms 22. We can read about people in their faith going through stages of disorientation. That did not mean they had a deficient faith. It meant they were growing in their faith, and they continued to cry out to the Lord. The Psalms is full of laments. You might sometime in your reading of Scripture start to ask yourself about those laments, those crying out to God. And so there's a place for that. We know the backstory of Job, don't we? But did Job know that backstory? Perhaps he thought God didn't have confidence in him, or God was angry with him. He certainly thought that God was somehow displeased with him, and if he could just come into the court of God's presence, then he could make his case. Of course, when he comes into the court of God's presence, you'll remember what happened. God's glorious love and power and majesty overwhelmed him, and he didn't say anything. And yet, when we look at that discussion with Satan and God about Job, it was actually the Lord's confidence in Job that led to his suffering. And so that's interesting. Think about Asaph in Psalm 73. You remember at the beginning of the 73rd Psalm, he says, surely God is good to Israel, those who have a clean heart. But he says, my feet almost slipped. I almost lost my faith. Why? The same kinds of things we often go through. We look around ourselves and we see some rebellious and ungodly and unrighteous people who seem to be prospering, don't they? And then on the other hand, we see those who are striving to lead a godly life. And Asaph would cry out and say, have I cleansed my hands in innocence for nothing? In vain. Later on in verse 22 of that psalm, though, he would say, I was thinking like an animal. I was thinking like a beast, because he had taken God out of the equation. And don't you love verses 16 and 17? He says in verse 16, I think the King James says, he says, it was too painful for me. Looking at suffering and travail without the hope of God is too painful, isn't it? But he says, then I went into the sanctuary of God and I understood their end. And so it's something worthy of us thinking about. We don't have to feel guilty for thinking about it. The greatest servants of God have thought about it, and healthy faith will. I want to spend most of our time in this session doing my best to address what I believe to be problematic arguments for many of our atheist friends or skeptical friends about suffering, and maybe offer some suggestions about how we might approach them in a productive way. I'm not dealing so much with the emotional side of suffering right now. That would be great to talk about in our Q&A discussion. But I want to focus on it from an intellectual standpoint. What seems to be a very strong argument, if we haven't thought through it, by an atheist really is filled with problematic areas even for him or her. And so as we think about this, let's try to get the idea that we often hear. And sometimes I think we grant too much ground to the atheist instead of thinking through these things. But basically, and J.L. Mackie summarized it well, a lot of other folks have expressed it. He was an Australian philosopher, and this is fundamentally what he says. And I'm sure you've heard it from others, from Harris and Dawkins and others. But he said, look, if you believe in an all-powerful, all-loving, all-benevolent God, how could there be suffering in this world? How could evil even exist in this world? And so since we know evil exists in the world, and you say God is all-loving and all-powerful, those two ideas are so incompatible that there's no God. So he goes from non-goodness and the existence of evil to non-existence. That's basically the argument. And if you hear that and maybe you haven't thought completely through that or tried to consider that, you might have asked yourself, okay, I'm working on that in my faith, but what do I say to this? But here's the interesting thing. When our atheistic friends begin to appeal to all the things they appeal to, they have to plagiarize from Christianity and theism in order to even make their argument against God. Now just try to chew on that for a while. They need God to argue against God, which would tell you that this argument is fallacious, would it not? The presuppositions, the foundations, and that kind of thing. And so, here's an unbeliever that starts saying, well, if evil exists and God exists, then that would be unjust and immoral and unrighteous and ungodly. That's starting to sound like a gospel sermon there for a minute. And so I think it's important for us, as we're talking to our friends and we live in a more skeptical, unbelieving society than ever, we may live in a time and culture that is most similar to the first century Christians than any other time in our nation. The pluralism and false views and the diversity of those things. And so what I would say is, let's not be afraid to engage this conversation. Let's do it for the sake of truth and for the sake of souls. Let me share a few quotations that I think are very helpful along this line. They're pretty lengthy, but you look like brave souls this morning. So here we go. This is from Alistair McGrath in his work, Mere Apologetics. So just notice what he has to say. He says, some atheists argue that the existence of suffering is evil and therefore is in itself adequate to disprove the existence of God. He says this is a curious argument since closer examination shows that it is self-defeating. An argument from the existence of evil to non-existence of God depends on establishing that suffering is indeed evil. But this is not an empirical observation. It is a moral judgment. Suffering is natural. For it to be evil, a moral framework has to be presupposed. But where does this framework come from? The argument requires the existence of an absolute moral framework if it is to work. Yet the existence of such an absolute framework is itself widely seen as pointing to God's existence. In the end, the non-existence of God seems to end up depending on God's existence. It's just not the best argument. Yet if it's simply my personal perception that nature is evil, this has no relevance to the debate about God. This is kind of interesting because atheists often will say, well, you guys are so subjective and you just run off your feelings and emotions and you're just simple-minded. And yet when he begins to make his argument, often the thought hasn't happened to show you're having to presuppose the very things that defeat your argument. This is C.S. Lewis and his well-known work, Mere Christianity. And as you know, C.S. Lewis, well known for some of his work regarding his belief that developed over a period of time in the existence of God. But he began as an atheist, and he says actually it was his argument about the justice or injustice of belief in God that led him out of his atheism. That's the very thing we're talking about. So this suffering issue, while it may seem like it's a friend to the atheist, is actually the nemesis of the atheist and the arguments that he may be making. Let's notice this together. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, and of course that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years, I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question because I kept on feeling whatever you say and however clever your arguments are, isn't it much simpler, he says, to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious? But he says, but then that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of unjust? He says a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own, but if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too, for the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not please my fancies. He later says, namely, my idea of justice was full of sense. Now watch this. And this is one of my favorite lines in this quotation, because we get that charge of, well, you're just too simple-minded. Listen to what he says. He says, consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. It turns out to be an oversimplification. And brethren, listen, if you're going to offer critique of the biblical account, the best advice I can give, read it. Read it. I mean, if I'm expected, and I am, and rightly so, as a believer, as a Christian, as a theist, to be fair with those who don't believe in God and actually represent their context appropriately, is it not right for me to ask that they do the same? And if you're going to criticize the biblical account of humanity and how evil came into this world, whether you believe it or not, the Christian believes it, so you have to represent that rightly if we're going to have an intelligent conversation about this. And so, turns out to be too simple. If the universe had no meaning, how did we ever figure out that it had no meaning? And I know sometimes when you read C.S. Lewis, you get dizzy between the ears, but he's really getting at the heart, as McGrath is, of some of these issues. So let's go a little further. I want to talk to you about morality. You know, when we talk to our atheist friends, and I think this can happen in any discussion, even among religious people, it's very common that we might be using some of the same words but mean entirely different things. And if we don't define our terms, and we all know this, if we don't define our terms, then you may be using a word and I may be using a word, and we think we both are saying something we're not. So when it comes to the issue of morality as it relates to belief in God versus non-belief in God or atheism, this is especially important because there's a couple of things that happen when we have discussions with our atheist friends. One of them will be, they may say, well, are you saying if I don't believe in God, I cannot lead a moral life, that I'm inherently going to be an immoral person? I want to be very clear about this. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, though, is if you're an atheist and you lead a moral life, you do so in spite of your atheism, not because of it. You do so because you've actually inculcated in yourself moral values that you don't believe in the foundation of those same things, see? And so I'm not saying, could you be faithful to your wife, or could you be a person I can have business dealings with? I'm not saying that just because you're an atheist it's going to make you immoral. I am saying there's no foundation for your morality if you really embrace atheism. Secondly, when our atheist friends talk about morality, they'll say, well, I believe we ought to be moral. Often what they are talking about is, or always just about, because they don't believe in God, they're not talking about objective morality. If they are, we really need to have more study because that'll lead you to the existence of God. They're talking about something that's very culturally based. Sometimes they'll use the phrase social contract, and what they mean is whatever we deem in the best interest of our given culture or society. And so it's not really something objective. It's not something that's always right or wrong. It's survival of the fittest. It's that kind of thing. When I'm talking about morality as a believer, or you're talking about it as a believer, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about merely cultural order of the day that changes from one decade to the other, or in our society, 1 year, 6 months to the other. And so, is morality merely an arbitrary pattern of social behavior? Is that all it is? Well, if you don't believe in God, that has to be what you say. Is it merely conduct that benefits a given society? So how can the atheist argue against the existence of God based on morality, justice, and goodness? Listen to me. If I'm having a conversation with my atheist friend and he uses any of those words, the argument is over. Now, he or she may not see that, and I'm going to try to help them to see that. But I would just say, okay, before we get started here, what do you mean by morality? Explain that to me. What does that really, give me a good definition of that. Because I can define what I mean because I believe it's grounded in the existence of God. But you don't have the existence of God. So you've got to tell me that. So when we talk about objective morality, here's the other thing. It's true whether we believe it or not. Me believing a thing is not what determines that the thing is true. My society or culture or time or family, that's not what determines these things. They've already been determined by the very nature of God. But if you don't believe in God, see, you don't have any grounding of that. So this whole discussion about morality, and by the way, we can see that in our society, can we not? That the definition of morality changes in the minds of many, even the definition of whether you're a man or a woman. How we're going to define gender, it's not an objective morality. So, by the way, this thinking would have to be illogical and irrational. You know, the atheist says, well, the reason I don't believe in God is because I'm so rational and logical. Oh, yeah? Where did it come from? Where did that logic come from? It can't just be subjectively what you think about it. You have to have some standard, but you can't have an absolute standard, see. I can as a believer. A Christian can, a theist can, but you can't. And so that's a good place to have that particular discussion. Now I want to address something else along that line. I had a young lady that worshiped with us, and she was taking some summer courses at, it was actually the University of Central Arkansas in Conway. And she had to take a philosophy class, and we warn our kids about the science classes. Let me tell you, you better warn them about that philosophy class too. And so we try to do that where we are And when we get new freshmen in for college, we're going to have that conversation pretty early on. Are you taking a philosophy class? Let's talk through it. Now, it can differ depending on the professor, but this particular professor was an atheist. And he made it very clear, and it was one of those intensives, during a particular day. And she calls me and she says, "Hey, Mr. Bruce." I still had hair then, so they'd call me Mr. Bruce instead of Brother Reeves. But she said, "Mr. Bruce," she said, "my professor said he had a question and he wanted all the good Christians to answer this question. Did God create morality?" And she said, what should be my response? And I said, well, that's a pretty sneaky question. Because we're tempted, as a Christian, you might be tempted to say, well, God created morality. Bad answer. Because if you argue that God created morality, then what happened before he created it? That means he would have to be immoral before he created it. And there was a time when there was no morality. So I told her, I said, I tell you what, when you go back into class, you tell him that morality is as God is, because morality is rooted and grounded in the eternal attributes of God. And she said she told him that, and he came back and he winked at her and said, "Good one," and moved on. But I'm just saying, having those kinds of discussions in Bible class, that's what we want to do. We want to have those kinds of healthy discussions so we can convert people who may be struggling. So, is morality grounded in God or simply an expression of the selfish gene? Dawkins and others will basically argue, oh yeah, it would be immoral for us to commit murder because that wouldn't be in the best interest of survival of the fittest, because if I think about going and murdering somebody else, that means somebody else might come murder me. This turns into some kind of narcissistic, selfish gene behavior. The Christian thinks completely different. The Christians read what Jesus says. When you look at how you treat them, when you treat the disenfranchised or the poor or your fellow man, they've been created in God's image. Genesis 1:26 through 28 says we've all been created in God's image. By the way, it's faith in God that leads to a high view of humanity, isn't it? Not a low view, a high view. We've been created in the image of God. How is that going to transform our marriages and our relationships and our communities when that's how we perceive of the context? Richard Dawkins would even speak about this. Let me move on. We've covered, these are good questions I want to get out there. These are good questions. I mean, I need to answer some questions. My friend that's a skeptic these would be good questions if we're having a real conversation here. What's the basis of objective moral values according to atheism? What would that be? What's the basis of human value on atheism? By the way, this is why if you're an atheist, most of the time, and I'm being as gracious as I can be, you know what position you're going to take on the pro-life, pro-choice issue. But if you're a Christian, and I know there are some that claim to be pro-choice, that's the most nonsensible position I can imagine. Why should we do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing? What is the basis of moral responsibility? Here's Richard Dawkins. He says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. There you go. No evil. Why are you talking to me about evil in the world? You don't think there is any evil. Which one is it? If you're going to tell me there's evil, we'll talk about it. That's fair. Let's talk about where you get that foundation. Those are the cold, hard facts of atheism. Whether the atheist accepts that or not, Richard Dawkins pretty much threw it out. And I came across this crazy scholar named Dan King. I want you to see what Dan, excellent book on God Does Exist, But I want you to look at this syllogism because I think that really helps us. Here it is. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. That has to be the logical conclusion. Premise number 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. We know that's the case. Even sometimes people that don't have anything to ground them in really want to say that's the way it is. Conclusion, God exists. So we need to think about this. God-centered morality is much different than man-centered morality. Intrinsically valuable and rational persons do not come from impersonal, non-conscious, unguided, valueless processes over time. How would that even work? So you're appealing to logic and intelligence and reasoning and morality. Where did you get those notions? As Brother King mentions, there's a choice to be made there. Now, there's only really 2 choices. There's really only 2 choices. If you can think of a third option, you can let me know, but I don't know of a third option. So here we are, naturalism. It's going to indicate a denial of absolute and intrinsic moral values, okay? It's a necessity logically. If you believe in God, that which is supernatural, we can have an affirmation of absolute morality because it's grounded in God, in His attributes. Romans 1:18 through 20, you remember, talks about the divine attributes and the power of God in creation. By the way, which is the foundation in Romans chapter 1 of a context where he goes on to condemn what? Immorality and idolatry. There is no logically consistent third option. So let's come back to where we began, and that is God's goodness and human suffering. And let's go back to what we were talking about with J.L. Mackie. It's fraught with problems. There's words they can't define. They have to plagiarize to even make the argument. But let's again go back. So their assumption, and here's the thing sometimes we grant too quickly. Their assumption is that it is not justifiable for a good God and a powerful God to allow suffering, right? That's the argument if they're making one. And therefore, since it's not justifiable, God doesn't exist. If you grant that to them, you're granting way too much. The fact is, if we can demonstrate that in God's wisdom and power, that it was justifiable for him to hold his nose and tolerate evil for greater divine purposes, that it was justifiable, that there is a logic reason why he did that. And I'm dealing from the intellectual approach to this. Then this whole argument falls flat. So number one, if you can't define words you're using to make the argument consistently, then you don't have an argument. But secondly, if you can't make your point that it was not justifiable, you don't have an argument. Okay, so I'm going to argue this morning that God has a morally justifiable reason for having created a world, listen, in which evil could occur. Now let's talk about why that might be, and I think that will be greatly helpful to us. And this goes back to, at least if you're going to critique this, you need to look at what the account is. So when we go back, Genesis offers a much brighter alternative than atheism does. What we have in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 is God creating this beautiful, powerful world. We have the creation of Adam and Eve in God's image. But what's God's motive? Remember when maybe you got married and you had that conversation, you wanted to have children and have a family and start talking about why you wanted to have kids, and right now you might be saying, you know what, I do not remember why we had kids. You may have a hard time remembering that conversation. Well, you wanted to have a family, you wanted to have children because you recognize your children are in the image of God. and you recognize the value of relationship and in raising your children, the nurture and admonition of the Lord to be servants of the Most High King, and to show God's grace and forgiveness to others. Let's talk about God for a minute. We talk about God's attributes, His power, His love, but God is a relational being. Think about the Godhead, the Father, Son, and Spirit. They have the most beautiful, eternal, harmonious fellowship and relationship. And when He creates man, it's not only so that we would share our love with Him, but that He would share His love with us. And that we would be in relationship together. Now, logically, what does that demand? If we're going to have a loving relationship with God, there has to be freedom of will. I mean, real libertarian freedom of will, choose A or B. We can't be robots. That wouldn't be love. Now, what that means is God created us. He did not create us evil. He did not create an evil world. But He had to create a world, good, that had the potential to go the wrong way. But even then, in His powerful grace, He would offer redemption and salvation through Christ. And so when we get into that understanding, now my atheist friend may not like that story, but that is the story, and that is the account of God's creation as our creator. Is God happy when He sees evil in the world? No. But He has greater purposes. Think about it. As terrible as evil and suffering may be for us, what about God? What about a perfectly holy God who knows He will have that final judgment, who providentially has shown us His justice and righteousness in dealing with men? But He is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. Now, you may not like that. Somebody else may not like that, but that's the biblical account, and that's morally justifiable. That's morally justifiable to give us free will to create man that was good. How did evil get here? Adam and Eve opened up that door. But even when they opened up that door and suffering comes and sickness comes and death comes, Romans 5 makes it clear who's responsible for our spiritual death, but we know in 1 Corinthians 15, God promises the future bodily resurrection for a super reversal of these effects of man's choices that were sinful. Thank God for Jesus. So why would He permit this? Again, let me notice something from C.S. Lewis. He said, of course, God knew what would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, He thought it worth the risk. If God thinks this state of war in the universe a price worth paying for free will, then we may take it as worthy paying. Somebody says, Bruce, do you think He knew that the majority of humanity would reject Him? Let me tell you something. He loves you that much. If somebody says, why did God, this is a normal question and a fair question, why did God create humanity if He knew most of them were going to reject Him? He was willing to undergo that rejection for His people if they made that choice. But it was their choice He allowed them to make. I want to address something else that has to do with the attributes of God that I think bears a very important role in this. Went too far. Let me back up. There are especially two divine attributes that, again, the atheists bring up, and I actually believe have a very superficial understanding of those things. And unfortunately, sometimes, and I'm not speaking of this audience, but sometimes we probably all heard some pretty superficial understanding of the attributes of God in Bible class. So if as a Christian, I'm responsible to think through these things about the attributes of God, to be able to study and talk. Don't just say, well, I don't know what to say to an atheist, I'm going to go the other direction. No, I want to be able to engage if they're willing to study in a fair way. And so let's think about God's power. Somebody says, wait a minute, that's where Mackie wants to start out. God is all-powerful, and then the definition is given that God being all-powerful means God can do absolutely anything open-ended. No, that's not the biblical definition of omnipotence, ladies and gentlemen. God has the power to do anything that is in harmony with His will and nature. So when we talk about the power of God, Just think about the passages, God cannot lie. Why can God not lie? Well, because that would violate his nature of holiness and who he is. When God gives us his word, now sometimes he gives us conditions, but when he gives us his word, we know that. We can trust that. God has a purpose for us to have freedom of will, and even if that means we have to go through this suffering, and that actually points us toward Christ, points us toward our hope in God, and he deems that justifiable because he loves us, and he's doing soul building in the process, and it was man's decision, but he offers redemption from those consequences through Christ in final eternity. Who am I to tell him he can't do that? And if we define power rightly, so if an atheist says, well, it means God has the power to do anything, just say, no, he has the power to do anything that's in harmony with his will and nature. But then there's goodness. You know, some people have the idea if God is good, that means we'll never have any real pain and suffering, and if God is good, he'll give in to whatever whim. I'll get the job promotion, I get the big car, and I've got the coffee cup that's got all the verses on it, so I know this is all gonna work out. Well, that's not really what we see in God's goodness, is it? God's goodness, by the way, even when I'm suffering, God's good. God's goodness is that he puts my supreme interest where they ought to be. And you know, my spiritual well-being is much more important than my physical well-being. Now, that doesn't mean I don't pray to God about my physical well-being. I do, but listen, even when I pray for food, it's not just so I'll have a full belly. I pray for food, you pray for food in the context of serving God and his kingdom. And so if we can understand that, that will go a long way. Lewis again says, we want, in fact, not so much a father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, not to insult any grandparents, because I think we probably have a few, whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be said at the end of each day, a good time was had by all. I should very much like to live in a universe which was governed on such lines, but since it is abundantly clear that I don't, and since I have reason to believe, nevertheless, that God is love, I conclude that my conception of love needs correction. I mean, that gets it. Instead of saying, oh, well, this doesn't fit my view of God being good. This doesn't fit my view of God's love. Well, maybe your view of God's love isn't God's love. Maybe that's your selfishness or short-sightedness or whatever it is. Maybe what I need is to let God chisel out a really more healthy view of what it means to be his servant. Now, I need to shift gears. I'm going to go pretty quickly, but we can talk about this in just a moment. Let me bring up, is the Old Testament God moral? And I want you to turn, and this is probably something we might want to talk about more because it's just a commonly called or asked for question, so I'm just going to touch on it and kind of reserve it for the next session if that's okay. We're going to look here at Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 20, and I'd like for us to have a good discussion about the Canaanites, because this is an argument that is made a lot by skeptics and unbelievers, and this is one that we have to think through a little bit as Christians. And this is going to be another case, and I'll just put that on the table. We're going to look at these passages. We're going to talk about the Canaanites. This is another case where often the atheist just doesn't give all of the biblical data and information about this to try to make those who believe in God and the Bible fit into a context, and God fit into a context that is not fair, it's not right, and it's not accurate. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that there. Let me end here. We'll come back to those. I want to go back to this argument we've been working on. Definition of terms and how that applies and what the biblical story or account really says. But I want you to notice something that I think needs to be tweaked here a little bit by the skeptic. So, we looked at J.L. Mackey at the very beginning. And those who argue this, here's how it goes. They will say, well, if God is all good, he would defeat evil. If God is all powerful, he could defeat evil. But evil's not yet defeated. hence there's no God. That's the argument, right? But here's the problem. Again, whether you believe it or not, you've got to accept what the Christian is arguing. Because evil is not yet defeated does not mean it never will be defeated. See, that's the assumption in that. Now, let me move us here, and I think you'll see how this backfires, besides all the problems with using words like good and justice and what's right. If God is all good, he would defeat evil. I'm not going to deny that. If God is all powerful, he could defeat evil. I certainly won't deny that. Therefore, God will defeat evil. And let's think about the biblical presentation. God not only will defeat evil in the future, he's presently working against evil right now through Christ and his people. So, if that's the case, the argument we started with implodes. There's no foundation for it in the first place. Now, if you want to attack that, you're going to have to attack that. But you can't attack a position that says that the Christian or theist or believer thinks that evil will just be here permanently, unless you believe in AD 70 doctrine, that's a whole different sermon, that you think evil is going to be here permanently. Because none of us in here who are Christians believe that. We believe God is working against evil right now through Christ, through his church. And at the end, 1 Corinthians 15 says in the bodily resurrection return of Christ, it will have completely have been conquered. And we praise God for that. We'll stop there. So do we go right into this? Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, okay. I got you. Okay. Yeah. Oh, you can't reach it.
That was too. I was going to start us off.
Bruce, well done. I recently heard a denominational teacher who himself suffers from great physical ailments make the statement that suffering is the very best way to grow closer to God. What thoughts do you have about that statement?
I think that this statement, something about suffering that's unique to any other human experience. Paul talks about that with his thorn in the flesh. I think there in that passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 we're pretty familiar with, and the fact that that fought against his self-exaltation and pride keeps us away from God. So, depending on the Lord and his grace, and I don't know, even though we can say in our mind, I know that I depend on God, when you're really suffering,
Since the atheist makes the argument that evil would have to be eliminated for God to be good, take a few minutes and go back to the issue of the Canaanites, and does that not relate to that argument?
yes, thank you, Ron.
Do you mind?
A cheeseburger later.
Do you mind holding that?
Sure. Okay, let's talk a little regarding the Canaanites. Here, I'm going to just put it right here for the time being, if that's okay. Let's do that. I appreciate that. So good. Let's just move back. There we go. Okay, so this issue of the Canaanites and things like that, we're just going to focus in on them. How do we harmonize that with God's goodness and God's love? Because they're going to go back there. And the presentation is going to be pretty vicious. It's going to be that this was genocide, and by the way, this does not fit the definition of genocide. That is not what it was. Let me share some statements, and then we'll get into it from a biblical standpoint. Richard Dawkins, here's the kind of language he'll use. He says the destruction of the Canaanites was an ethnic cleansing, which it was not. But he says it was an ethnic cleansing in which bloodthirsty massacres were carried out with xenophobic relish, as if God's people were scared of strangers, I think is that idea. Let me approach that. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 7. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 7. It is my conviction, if we look at this text, and I'm not going to deny that God commanded them to bring his judgment on the Canaanites. But there's a history here, which atheists very rarely, if ever, give you the history if they know it. There can be no denial in my mind that there is a context in which God commanded Israel to destroy the Canaanites. But why? And what was the context of that? Deuteronomy chapter 7, he mentions going in to possess the land and clearing these nations. He mentions the nations. And verse 2 says, "And when the Lord your God delivers them before you, and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them, and you shall make no covenant with them, and show no favor to them." He goes on to say, do not intermarry with them. He mentions God's anger. He talks about tearing down their idols. But come to Deuteronomy 20 now, and I want you to notice something important in Deuteronomy 20, if you can. Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20. Notice with me in Deuteronomy chapter 20, he gives some laws for warfare and that kind of thing. Let's pick up with verse 10. When you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If it agrees to make peace with you and opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall become your forced labor and shall serve you. However, if it does not make peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, you shall strike all the men in it with the edge of the sword. Only the women and children and the animals and all that is in the city, all its spoil, you shall take as booty for yourself, and you shall use the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. Now, verse 15 is very important here. Verse 15 says, thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations nearby. Only in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for your gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. Now, my personal conviction is you don't do the skeptic any favors by trying to water down what that text says. Because if you do, they're going to turn around and say, I can read that book better than you can. And so I don't think that's the way to approach it. But there's some serious problems in this for the atheist. And I think this is probably what Brother Ron is pointing towards. So I want to think about 4 of them, okay? I think it's about 4. So first of all, we go back to where we started. How is the atheist talking to me about God being moral in the first place? He has no grounding of this. Again, here we go again. He's talking about evil and justice and morality. He has nothing to ground that in the first place. He believes in moral relativity. And so I don't know how he's going to even make this argument. But secondly, is God arbitrary, or does he have reasons for his judgment on the Canaanites? This is what the atheist tries to say. God is arbitrary. He just, I guess he got up one morning and said, I'd like to kill some Canaanites today, and that's not what happened. God had held his vengeance back for approximately 400 years, according to Genesis chapter 15 and verses 13 and 16. So he's been patient. And by the way, if they had repented before God, God would have been merciful to them, I'm confident. Also, it needs to be acknowledged that when Yahweh brought judgment on the Amorites, who they were extremely immoral. They were sexually deviant, they were abusive, they were cruel, and they were vicious. Now, you don't get your cake and eat it too here. And so God is being righteous. Hebrews 11:31 says they were very disobedient. Listen, they're involved in ritual prostitution and child sacrifice. Now, all the things today that, some who are very liberally inclined say they're, standing for some of these things, yet they're arguing against God bringing judgment on those who are the abusers. And so there's that. Skeptics attempt to put God's actions into a selfish, arbitrary category, whereas the Bible describes his actions as retribution. Okay, I want to point out something else that goes right along with that. And that is, I'm going to ask how that's consistent. And here's what I mean. We hear a lot about God can't be good if he allows evil, right? That's the question, if he permits evil. So we get all this pushback from atheists that your God would have to be evil, therefore he doesn't exist, but he has to be evil to allow evil to go on. That's the accusation. So they complain about non-intervention out of his mercy, but then when he intervenes, they cry foul. Now here would be my suggestion, and that is that the real problem here is not about the Canaanites. If you're going to attack God if he does not intervene and if he does intervene, I think we have every right to say, I think you're just grabbing whatever argument you need to in the moment to try to argue against God. And let me mention this idea that Israel was afraid of strangers. Have we not read Genesis 12:3 that talks about Abraham being the seed through which all nations of the earth would be blessed? Have we forgotten that God punished Israel through pagan nations as well as pagan nations through Israel? Have we forgotten all those civil laws about protections for strangers in Israel? And so there's nothing like that in the scripture. And story after story of outsiders coming in, Rahab and Ruth. Ruth gets into the Messianic lineage. And then one more thing is this, and that is God's committing murder. That's a common one along this line. No, he's not. Because he's the creator of life, first of all. Now, this question about God's murder, if you think about it, God is transitioning souls from one realm to the other. The young ones that would have perished, whether it's the flood or this, would have been in paradise. And so does God have a right to transition a soul from one sphere to the other? Yes, he does. So, we know that. We sometimes will say, well, he's trying to play God. What does that mean, he's trying to play God? Except implying that God has a right to be God. We don't, right? So I think, and I'm sorry that's such a long answer, Ron, but I think all of those things, that's another one. If you just, if we could just dig on in. And let me tell you guys something, and I won't forget you, Bobby, that what I have, my experience, and I'm going to imagine you guys too, I have not found, now I'm sure they're out there somewhere, our junior high, high school, college students at Highway 65, do you know I've never, ever, ever had one complaint from them about having these discussions about this, because they're dealing with it every day with their friends. I have had grandparents sometime that just didn't want to go there, and I don't, not all grandparents, I'm just saying there are people sometimes, they don't want to hear those lessons. We've got to talk about this stuff. We just do. I got Bobby, and I'll come back to you. Go ahead, Bob. Oh. Hang on, I want to hear this.
For the streaming, maybe not.
Well, all right. Because we want to hear Bruce's answers too. I'll run it back to Bruce.
Okay.
It'll make me forget my answer.
Uh-oh. Answer a question.
At my age, I easily forget these things. The problem with the atheist is that he wants to make God in his own image. That's exactly the problem. I answered a psychology professor from Athens State University 20 years ago in the newspaper here, He had a regular column. Every other week, they allowed him to write a column. And when I tried to answer him, they limited me to a letter to the editor of 300 words. So, of course, I had to chisel it and whittle it down. But I told them then, Genesis 15 shows that God took a measured approach. He said, the cup of their iniquity is not yet full. But the time came when that cup filled up. He gave them time to do exactly what he allowed the Ninevites to do in the case of Joseph. Jonah, not Joseph. He allowed them the time to repent. They didn't use it. And so God, in his sovereignty, in his superintendence of the universe, his overruling the nations, brought them to an end because of the iniquity. Now, the problem is the atheist wants to make his God in his own image, like I said. This psychology professor tried to distinguish between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. I'd been confronted with that other times before. So I just kindly supplied him some New Testament references to show him that the God of the New Testament follows the same principles. He doesn't vary at all from the God of the Old Testament in that regard. But like I say, they want God to be what they make him out to be, and that's the father of idolatry in every generation.
I need it.
I appreciate that, Brother Bobby. Let me mention a couple of things there. You know, basically it is not only making God into the God they want, making themselves God, and you're exactly right. I think in connection with that, that's an underlying point that the idolatrous nature of this has to continue to be an issue that we really push for God's people to see that, you know, this whole thing, everybody believes in something, and I think it's that book by Geisler in them that says, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I think that's really true. And I think if I'm, maybe Rick can mention this, but I think if I'm studying with somebody and they're starting to come, you know, around, that's not a bad approach to say, really, when you look at the data and the information from a logical standpoint, and I meant to say this, I don't have to prove the existence of God. I have to demonstrate that it is the most logical, reasonable approach. And if I can prove it's the most logical, reasonable approach, then that's the approach I need to take with my faith in God. Okay. Rick wanted to say something.
Really good lecture. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and I need your help. I work with a lot of Islamics. You know, I meet them a lot. And I had a debate, and this is the argument they threw up to me, and it was hard for me to answer, so maybe you can help me with it. They said, do you believe that the God of the New Testament is the same God of the Old Testament? And of course I said yes. They said, okay, do you believe that your God is a loving God? Yes. Well, they brought out several of these scriptures. How can you serve a loving God that would command his people to kill men, women, and children, including men, and wipe out whole nations? So how do you answer that to an Islamic?
The first thing I would say is it is the same God in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament is also a God of grace and mercy. The God of the New Testament is also a God of severe judgment based on what Romans chapter 11 says. So there's that. But I don't think his dealing with theocracy and national Israel and all of those things and killing the Canaanites is any kind of a long-term pattern for how we deal with that under the new covenant. But that doesn't mean he's a different God. And I think there is a misconception that in the Old Testament there was no love and grace in God, and that in the New Testament, and this is what we usually battle against, that there's not righteous judgment coming from God. So I think I also would emphasize to him the context. I don't know if this helps, Rick, but what we were talking about with the 400 years and the vicious sins they were involved in and that kind of thing. Well, the God of the New Testament, what does he say in Romans 1 that he's going to do? He's going to bring judgment on those things. So I think that assumption that the Old Testament God is not a loving God is one that cannot be proven. And I think I would go back and look at that context. I don't know, does that help at all? The Canaanites and all the sins they were involved in the 400 years, and then seeing that God also promises judgment now at the end. Does anybody else have another comment? Go ahead.
Examples of grace in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's a good point. Lance said the examples of all of God's grace and mercy in the Old Testament, go to those to balance them out. That might be what I would do. I'd go to that, explain the context of the Canaanites and what the sins were in the 400 years. Then I would go to look at the grace and mercy that we see, Ruth, Naomi, and all of that. And then I would come to the New Testament and show God's righteous judgment against the same kinds of sin that he promises. And the reason, and you know, by the way, there were peoples in the Old Testament that didn't get punished that way, that were guilty of sins. So they will in the end. I got to cover. I got Mike, and then Ron, and then everybody else. Steve, you're on the...
He can't interrupt. You know, this evil issue goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Like you introduced that for us, that in creation, in the Garden of Eden, and God was willing to take the risk. But when God created everything 6 times, he says in Genesis, it was good. But whenever he comes to the conclusion, he says, it is very good. It is just the way I want it. It was a world in which a devil could tempt man. And man had choice. And it makes us come back to this, what was the will of God? If he was trying to build a candy land, he failed. But what he was doing is creating us to be fitted for eternal dwelling with him. And so you have to go through this that Adam and Eve went through. In all of our life we do. We see it got so bad that the flood, he wiped everybody out, but he said, I'm not going to do that anymore. So what did he do? He changed the languages that resulted in the creation of nations. And by Genesis 15, we have this statement about, I'm not going to send Israel into the land of Canaan until the iniquity of the Amorites is full. And he was using Israel on the Amorites the same way he did the Assyrians on the Israelites. This is God's way of controlling wickedness. He's not interested in a one-world government. I don't know any man fitted to be the ruler over a one-world government. I fear all of us, myself included. But this is the will of God for how he controls the wickedness that occurs in our nation.
Yeah, I was just going to add, in talking with the Muslim, part of my response would be, what did Muhammad do? He used the sword, and if you read the Quran, it includes things like, you know, if the Christians and the Jews will make peace with you, then you can spare them. Well, that matches very much what you read in the Old Testament, except the ones that were so corrupt and belligerent and so forth, then God dealt with them. One more quick comment, just because I know all of us are looking for practical things, and I haven't read as deeply as you have in evidences, But the most practical thing I think I ever stumbled across, a Baptist preacher became a biology teacher in college. He said students would approach me because they knew I used to be a preacher and say, I'm beginning to be troubled about evolution and things like that. And he said, I always let them say what they were troubled about and try to discuss that. But he said, I never let them leave my office without asking, and since you came to college, what sins have you gotten involved in? Now that's practical. What he was trying to teach them, your sins relate to your doubts. That's what opens your mind to these doubts. And we need to find ways to address that when we're trying to work with these people.
You want to respond, or you want to give another
No,
question?
let's give it, I'm trying to remember
Who was next? Phil?
Just to follow up with the Old Testament God and grace, two passages come to mind: Exodus 34, 6 and 7, and then in Deuteronomy 7, where you were at, verses 9 through 11. So can I read one of those? Or all right, so Deuteronomy 7, 9 through 11. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them. He will not be slack with one who hates him. He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do the commandment and the statutes and the rules that I command you today. And then in Exodus 34, again, the same kind of thing. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And that's, again, the golden calf context. I mean, God has always been gracious and merciful. And so he is the same. We just, as you said, need to read the context and look at the Bible, and we can see that. So.
Well, first, Bruce, really good job. And this probably gets into something we'll talk about more in the afternoon session. But we've already got plenty of questions, so maybe we won't get back to it. But, you know, when people ask, how can you believe in a God who's this misogynistic, unrealistic, irrationally violent and vindictive God? And, the quip answer to that is, I'm an atheist there. I don't believe in that God. That is not the God that I find in the Bible. But maybe part of the issue, and this gets to another thing, is we want to give biblical answers, as we've heard some really good biblical answers from you and from the audience. But maybe because we live in a culture that's not biblically oriented in many ways, maybe just some common sort of thing. I'm thinking about something like Miroslav Volf, who's this Yale ethicist, but he's Croatian, and he grew up during and experienced the kind of ethnic cleansing that went on in the old Yugoslavia, which, to Rick's question, was actually committed largely by Muslims. And his comment is, I used to think that God was this Santa Claus. He talks a lot about God as a Santa Claus, which is how a lot of modern Americans particularly think of it. And he said, when I saw and experienced, all of the rape and the murder and entire villages being wiped out, many of them by Muslims, not solely. There was some going back the other way, but he said, shouldn't God be angry about that? I'm angry about that, and why should we think that God would not do that? So maybe sometimes a more telling response is not to quote Scripture, as good as that is, but to say, if you can relate to that kind of an idea, then you can understand why God might elect to allow certain kind of things. So I'm curious as to how you'd react with somebody like Wolf or whoever might make that argument.
wanted to make a couple of comments on some books. On page 485 of your lecture, very good lecture, Bruce, you mentioned that atheists take things from God. I wanted to mention the book that you had on page 485. It's really good, and I would encourage the audience to get it. It's called Stealing from God. My son put me onto this. I'm about halfway through it. It was revolutionary to me in this sense, and I should have caught this before, but everything that atheists bring up, they get it from us. They get it from God. And he uses, the author, Frank Turk, he uses the acronym CRIME, C-R-I-M-E. Each of those things they get from God. And then they try to turn around and argue against that. If you steal from someone, that implies that they exist. They're stealing from God. And so they steal creation, rationale, information, morality, and then I forget what the E was. But that was revolutionary to me to see that, to understand that everything they bring up and argue, they have gotten from us, and then they turn around and try to argue against that. And so we need to point that out. And one other thing, real quick. Back in the 1980s, I had Phil Roberts for the book of Job, and he recommended the little paperback. It's called The Roots of Evil. It was by a group called Probe Ministries. They are online. They're still online. That little book discusses all the possible worlds that God could have made, and the author discusses the best of all possible worlds, and he makes the point that evil comes about because of free will. And so you just simply need to ask the atheist, do you want to get up in the morning and have your free will? Of course he's going to say yes. Well, then you have to take the good with the bad, because evil and suffering come from free will. Everybody wants their free will, but then they want to turn around and say, well, we don't want any evil or suffering. You can't have it both ways. So The Roots of Evil by Probe Ministries. I don't know if the book still exists, but the article is on their website.
Just a quick follow-up with Rick's question. You mentioned God is transitioning us to the next life. You know, if you think about that in light of what Scripture teaches about, you have vindication of evil. He's not ignoring sinful behavior. But you also have the sparing of the innocent, because those women and children that were not guilty of that, they are spared of that if they've been involved in those sins. So there's an aspect of sparing the innocent, punishing the guilty.
One thing that just happened to think of a little while ago that we really haven't brought up in all of these arguments has to do with the foreknowledge of God. And when you think about, I always think about Hezekiah. You know, he was such a good king. He gets sick. He's about to die. Isaiah tells him, put your house in order, you're going to die. God was merciful to him, but then what happened after that? Manasseh is born. Manasseh becomes one of the worst kings, even has his child pass through fire. And how many other people in the nation of Judah allowed their children to pass through fire, be killed, and then ultimately they're oppressed and destroyed by the Assyrians, or nearly destroyed by the Assyrians. They don't go into Assyrian captivity, but 40 cities even during Hezekiah's time are oppressed by the Assyrians. So the foreknowledge of God is something also that we need to remember in our arguments about what appears to be a capricious, angry choice on the part of God may have other ramifications that God knows ahead of time, including even the creation of a perfect world in which there's the possibility of evil. God knew then, and even tells Eve that when she sins, you know, the ultimate victory over evil, he already knows ahead of time. So we just need to remember the foreknowledge of God in some of our arguments about this.
I'm gathered from all you guys. You really are very helpful. I need to do is dwell upon God's love and mercy, but his justice is what you're saying. And if we could put all that together, we can maybe have a good answer.
Let me, and I won't forget you, Brother Dick. And this is kind of off the subject, but you triggered my thought. And I know the atheists may not appreciate this, and we've all said in the book, but in the book, I have a list of several bad ways to answer this argument for Christians. So that might be somewhat beneficial, that some have tried to argue that won't work. The other thing I wanted to mention real quick so I don't forget is when we look at the will of God, sometimes we can be hyper simplistic about that. And so when you deal with, what God has commanded versus what God desires versus the permissive will of God, because God permits a thing, it is his permissive will, but he still has his will that he's commanded. And that can be a very healthy study, but I found that helpful to people along with this foreknowledge argument.
Thank you. Yeah, good lecture. Yes, I agree with the brother recommending the book Stealing from God. That's a good book. And that's what happens a lot of times. Anytime an atheist needs some morality, where's he going to get it? He's going to have to borrow it from God or steal it. And that's what that book is about. In regard to the Canaanites, it's not as though God didn't warn them. They'd been warned. And God does that numerous times. He warns people. He doesn't just spring it on us, just like hell is not going to be sprung on us. God has told us everything we need to know about hell, and Jesus talked more about that than anybody. That shows his goodness, that he would warn us about such a thing instead of springing it on us. Also, in regard to your comment about free will, we have free will. We can't blame God for all the suffering in the world. A lot of it comes from as a result of us exercising our free will, making wrong choices. And it makes as much sense to blame God for all the suffering as it would to blame Henry Ford for all the car wrecks or the Wright brothers for all the plane crashes. We don't do that, but we do that to God. So why? And yet that's a very inconsistency there. And let's see, one other thing. Yeah, Brother Haley used to make the point, and this always stuck in my mind, that God punishes nations in time, but individuals in eternity. And we see a history of that. God's not a torturer, but he does punish. And we're warned about future punishment. So God is very fair. You can see his love in all of this and warning us and telling us ahead of time. So those are just some observations I want to make.
Quick comments. We know as Christians a lack of sensitivity to the offense of sin to a holy God. That's going to be hard initially for a skeptic to get his mind wrapped around. So you just have to be aware of that. Of course, I don't agree with all of his theology, but William Lane Craig has a nice quote, and I think I put it in the book. But he's talking about these Old Testament issues, and this is kind of what we said. But he said it's interesting. The thing that repulses people when they read about the Canaanite thing or event is the very thing that points toward God. He said, where did they get all these values for justice and all of these sensibilities? They became rather sensitive about all those things. Well, you don't get that from atheism. So I appreciate what you said, Brother.
This has been an excellent discussion with regards to the origination of why we live in a pain-filled world. One of the things we didn't touch on, and I have my own answer, but I'm interested to listen to you, is the things about natural disasters, natural pain that occurs that are outside of a person's control. The reason I bring that up because denominational error attributes even those things to judgment. I had a friend of mine say that he had a stroke, and he said, I don't know what I've done to deserve this. And so we have to have an answer for those natural pains, those things that are outside of our control that are not directly linked to our personal sin. The comment I'll make, part of my answer is that the reason they're called, for example, if you get in an auto accident, the reason they're called accidents is because they're not on purposes. But that's still a problem of pain in our world. So I'd like to hear an answer about that.
I'll say at the very surface that while I agree God can use natural events however he sees fit, I think that is a mistake also in thinking that can undermine faith. We live in a natural world, I would argue a broken world in many ways. That's outside of maybe my personal decisions. But, you know, physical death comes upon us because of what Adam did. So that wouldn't bother me. I would say this, some may differ, and that's okay. I do have concern from the things I hear from many of our brethren that I deeply believe in the providence of God and believe we need to pray and rely on him. But I think a micromanaging view of God's providence can set what it may feel good when things are going well, but processing that in someone's faith as if, you know, every little thing is laid at the feet of God instead of events that occur because of the world we live in, I think that can be problematic. So, all right.
Got time for one more, maybe. Anybody?
I hear our brethren sometimes say, well, God has taken them home. You know, if a person passes away and stuff. God didn't cause that death. And I think we have to be careful of that terminology, because just like when working with people in other religions, especially Islamics, they'll run with that. So we have to be careful, I think, of sometimes the terminology that we use.
Anyone else?
You know, the wording in Ecclesiastes that speaks of time and chance, I think, acknowledges what you were pointing out about permissive will versus determined will. Are we ending?
I think so.
Thank you so much. Excellent word, and we appreciate it so much. Let me encourage you all to be back here at 2 o'clock as we continue some of this.